Okay, let's get started. So today, the topic is social psychology. I've mentioned in passing in 1100, I don't know if I mentioned it here, but this is a field of inquiry that is overlapping with sociology. So social psychology is the study of, I'm a little out of breath, apology, that as I said before I started recording, I took a wrong train this morning, it was just barely on time. But yes, social psychology is the study of human social interaction and how people think and feel about social interaction. So I'll start off with the observation that humans are a deeply social species, even compared to other social primates. There's some people who have argued that this is one of the main drivers of the evolution of human intelligence. So if you look at the correlation between group size in primates and the size of the cortex, which is the thinky part of the brain, it's a very strong positive correlation. So if you look just within primates, humans have the largest group sizes, even in the hunter-gatherer context. Groups are typically, does anyone know the magic number? There's a magic number that anthropologists have identified. Typically 150, that seems to be a reliable kind of minimum number for human group sizes. And of course we have the biggest brains, and the correlation exists even if you just look at non-human primates. Keeping track of human social interaction is difficult. There's a lot of complexities to navigate, and this may have been part of what drove our evolution as an intelligent species. Here's another observation. Think of prisons. What is the worst punishment, at least in North American prisons, that you can give someone in prison?
Solitary confinement?
Solitary confinement. Just think about that. You're surrounded by criminals, people charged with all sorts of things, and the worst thing you can do to someone is move them away from those people. So, all of that reinforces the point that we are a very social species. Now, for some reason, this chapter starts with the bad news. Different chapters in different books will order it differently. This one starts with the topic of aggression. Sorry, I'm going to have to pause the recording. Okay, so just a reminder for the folks at home, the APA assignment is due this Saturday at 11:59 p.m. So if you're watching this later, please hand that in on time. Okay, as I say, we're going to now talk about aggression. So a few terms you have to know. One that's pretty simple that I won't add too much to is the frustration-aggression hypothesis. This is an old idea in psychology, and it's very simple. It's that when your goals are frustrated, so you have a goal and you are prevented in some way from achieving it, this increases your likelihood of aggressive behavior. A lot of the early work here was done with animals, very simple experiments. You give an animal something it wants, stop it from getting it, you increase their chance of being aggressive. Psychologists often distinguish between two different types of aggression, proactive and reactive. For proactive, I prefer the term instrumental. Some books will use that. They are synonyms. So two types of aggression, proactive or instrumental, and reactive. Proactive or instrumental aggression is done to achieve a specific goal. It's not done necessarily out of anger or some other unpleasant emotion. So psychopaths engage in this a lot. Simple example, let's say you're a bank robber, or let's say I'm a bank robber, I'll make myself the bad guy. Go to rob a bank, there's a guard there, and I shoot the guard. I don't hate that guy. I'm not mad at him. I'm just trying to get the money. He's in my way, so I engage in aggression against him. If it's a school bully who wants the kid's truck, he may not hate the kid, but he wants the toy truck, pushes him out of the way, takes the truck. The pushing would be proactive or instrumental aggression. If the bully is just kind of a rage monster and just beats the crap out of some kid, that would be reactive aggression. So aggression arising out of anger or rage. Distinction makes sense? Yep. Yeah, for sure. So it's aggression that's done for to achieve some kind of goal. So the two examples I gave were, so think of the bank robber case. So my goal is I want the money. And there's a guard there, and I shoot the guard. I don't hate that guy. I just want the money. I'm engaging in the aggression to help me achieve my goal of getting the money. Oh, that's what was on the note. So I wanted to give myself a reminder that to thank you all for the reviews you gave. One that a few of you made was sometimes you find I talk too fast. So you have two options. One, of course, is to rewatch the video later. But as you all know, I strongly encourage questions. If you ever want to raise a hand and say, please repeat that, you're always welcome to do that, in case that wasn't obvious. Yeah, exactly. This is good. So reactive is when you are aggressive out of some kind of negative emotion, like anger or something like that. So the bully who beats a kid up, not to take his truck or something, but just because he's angry and wants to let it out on someone, that's reactive aggression. Okay, so those are two different types. There's then a section on the biological underpinnings of aggressive behavior. So as with virtually all psychological traits, aggressive behavior does have a genetic component. If you look at different measures of criminal or aggressive behavior, identical twins are more similar on those measures than non-identical twins, which is evidence of a genetic component. The book also discusses two hormones or neurotransmitters, testosterone and serotonin. Won't surprise you to learn that levels of testosterone are correlated with levels of aggressive behavior, especially social aggression. So by social, or I should say, aggression aimed at dominating other people. So trying to move up the hierarchy or attain more status. And this is true even within each sex. So obviously, males on average have more testosterone and engage in more dominance-oriented aggression. But even if you look just within males or within females, you see that testosterone levels are correlated with those types of aggression. With serotonin, there's evidence that low levels of serotonin are associated with aggression. To be more specific, impulsive aggression. So some have argued that part of the function of serotonin levels is to help one keep track of one's position in the hierarchy. And if you have low serotonin, you feel lower status and therefore are more willing to risk it all. You're more willing to engage in, as I say, impulsive aggression. So in short, higher testosterone on average associated with more aggression, especially dominance type aggression. Low levels of serotonin associated with more impulsive aggression. two brain areas involved. We've already seen these, the amygdala and the hypothalamus. So activity in the amygdala is correlated with many different emotions, probably more than any other single brain region. It shows up in studies of emotional responses. Aggression is one of the ones where that link is most well established. So in animal studies, for example, if you just stimulate the amygdala of a monkey, the most common thing it'll do is just get pissed off and want to fight other monkeys. So the amygdala is involved. The hypothalamus, you'll remember I gave you that funny trick to remember. It's involved in the 4 F's of survival. One of them was fighting. So it's the boss of the endocrine or hormone system. And hormones, of course, play a role in aggressive behavior. Any questions about the biological underpinnings of aggressive behavior? Okay, now culture, of course, plays a role too. The culture in which we grow up can modulate or affect how aggressive behavior is expressed. One of my favorite studies was done in the United States, and it looked at differences between men from the northern United States and the southern United States. And by south here, I really mean not like California, which is south, but like Texas, Alabama, Georgia, like the former Confederate states. So there's well-documented cultural differences between the North and the South. A term that sociologists and anthropologists use is, they talk about cultures of dignity versus cultures of honor. And the South is what they call a culture of honor, and the North is more of a culture of dignity. So in a culture of honor, if your honor, especially if you're a man, is threatened in some way, you are expected to retaliate, to defend your honor. There are other features of cultures of honor, but that's one of the core features. Whereas in a culture of dignity, you are expected to keep a stiff upper lip. Right? The more admirable thing to do is not retaliate. Show that you're not affected by it. So Canada, definitely more of a culture of dignity. Now this is more conjectural, but many sociologists have argued that there's a historical origin to these differences. And the explanation goes something like this. Cultures of honor tended to arise from herding type cultures. So say like Scottish or Irish culture, where there's a lot of sheep herders and jobs like that, at least historically. Whereas cultures of dignity tend to be more agriculturally based, so plants, not animals. Here's one consequence of that. If you're a sheep herder or a goat herder, you can lose all of your shit in one day. If a good thief comes along in the night, that your life can be seriously messed up. And therefore this leads to the requirement that you maintain a reputation for violence and retaliation. People need to be scared of you. Whereas if you're, planting corn or something, people can steal some of your stuff, but you're not going to lose your whole livelihood in one night. So there's less reason to maintain that reputation for violence or retaliation. So that's a bit conjectural, but that's one explanation that's been put forward. So in this study, they had university students who were from southern states, so actually one of them I used to live in Georgia, so places like Georgia, Texas, etc., and men from the north. It's like New York, Massachusetts, places like that. And they would have them in one room, did a variety of tests. The men would then be told to walk from that room to the next room where further tests would be performed. And by coincidence, someone walks down the hall and bumps them in the shoulder and yells at them saying, watch where you're going, asshole. Then in the other room, they do more tests. One of the things they measure is testosterone levels before and after the provocation. And what you find is men in the South, their testosterone goes up after being threatened or insulted. Men in the North, it does not. Now, it's not as though there's some genetic difference between men in the North, or at least it's unlikely that that's what's going on here. It's that the culture in which they grow up shapes how their biology reacts. So a really nice study of how culture affects how you respond. So another cultural, or I guess environmental variable is exposure to violent media. So a lot of work on this. It's a contentious area. It's not one that I would consider myself an expert in. There are experts who argue both sides of the debate. So obviously the first thing that you do is do some kind of correlational study. That's usually step one. And you do, as my read of the literature is, you do find a positive correlation between violent media exposure or violent video game use and other measures of aggressive behavior. But then, of course, the critics will respond and say, well, correlation doesn't mean causation. It could be that, aggressive people, people who are already aggressive play more video games, or there could be a third variable that causes both. So then you do experiments, and for experiments, you can't do the experiment of see who turns into a school shooter, but you bring people into the lab, you randomly assign them to two conditions. One plays a violent video game, one doesn't, and then you have some kind of proxy for aggressive behavior in the lab. Then the question is, how valid are those measures? But that's the kind of thing that researchers in this area do. Now, rather than get into the details of the debate, I'll mention two different theoretical perspectives. These are just good terms to know. And these theories lead to different predictions about what you should find in this area. One has a number of different names. The one in the key terms should be social learning theory. This comes from the psychologist Albert Bandura. And according to this theory, essentially, monkey see, monkey do. So people learn how to behave by observing other people behaving. So that theory would predict that increased exposure to violent media would increase violent behavior. Right? The more you're exposed to it, the more likely you are to imitate that kind of behavior. Another term you'll see is catharsis. This is a term that comes from our good friend Sigmund Freud. So Freud thought that, of course, aggressive impulses are part of our nature. He had a very animalistic view of human nature. And so you're going to have that whether you like it or not. What catharsis is an opportunity for releasing those impulses. So someone who's more of a Freudian would think that if you have violent media or violent video games, what they'll do is provide an opportunity for you to let out your aggressive impulses. So that would lead to the prediction that violent media should decrease aggressive behavior in the real world. So we won't adjudicate the debate, but that's what these two different perspectives would predict. Any questions about the differences between these? Okay. So that's aggression. The next section is on cooperation. So cooperation is when two or more people work together and they mutually benefit. So both or more parties to the cooperation all benefit in the short term, like as you're doing the task in question. The book then talks about a very famous kind of thought experiment on how cooperation works, and it's used a lot in economics and other areas to model how cooperation works. It's also important in evolutionary models. Now, it's just an analogy, but the analogy has a lot of the features that real cooperative situations have. So I'll start with the version that you'll usually see as the analogy. So the term, I should say, is the prisoner's dilemma. Have any of you heard the term prisoner's dilemma? So one or two. So here's the situation. Suppose you and your friend decide to become bank robbers. So you're cooperating to rob the bank. Now, don't worry about the fact that bank robbing is a bad activity. In this case, the cooperative thing is to help your friend. That's the kind of cooperation we're considering. You know, pretend you're robbing an evil bank, whatever. You're in an authoritarian country. There's no moral judgment here. So you and your buddy both get arrested, and let's say they have you on some weapons charges. They can for sure put you away on the weapons charges, but they can't prove that you robbed the bank. So they separate you and give you each the same deal. And each of you know that you're being given the same offer. Here's the way the offer works. So you're prisoner A. You can either confess or not confess. And here, confess is the not cooperative thing. You're not cooperating with your buddy. You're kind of stabbing him in the back. So confessing is stabbing your buddy in the back. Do not confess, you're cooperating with your buddy. So, and your buddy is given, as I say, the same offer. If neither of you confess, you both get a year on the weapons charges. So 1 year, 1 year. But let's say you confess, so you stab your buddy in the back, but he doesn't confess. You get parole, which is better than a year, of course, and your buddy gets life. So he gets, because he didn't stab in the back, so the police aren't going to give him any special help, so he gets life for the bank robbery. Same is true for him. If he stabs you in the back, but you don't, you're getting life, and he's getting off on parole. But if you both confess, well, you don't get any brownie points then, because you both did it, so you both get 20 years. So that's the setup. Now, here's the paradox. You don't want to end up here in this box, right, where you both confess on each other, then you get 20 years. But here's the thing. Regardless of what the other person does, it's better for you to stab your friend in the back. So let's ignore this half. Suppose your buddy doesn't confess, so he's being nice to you. If you're nice as well, you get a year, but if you stab him in the back, you get parole. Parole's better than a year. Okay, let's say he stabs you in the back. If you are nice and don't rat him out, you get life. If you do, you get 20. So in either situation, it's better for you to confess. But then both people think that, and you wind up here. That's what happens with the prisoner's dilemma. Now, I want to make this a bit more concrete, so we're going to play a little game. My evening class, they were a little reluctant to get up, but and I will cut this out of the video, of course, once you stand up, but I want you all to get a partner, and before getting up, I'll explain how it'll work. You're going to face away from your partner, and you have two choices, cooperate or defect. So defect would be like stab them in the back, right? So cooperate is going to be thumbs up, defect is going to be thumbs down. So you're going to turn away, you're going to make a decision, I'm going to say 3, 2, 1, and turn around. And these are points. So maybe we'll do like 2 or 3 just to make it competitive. And it will be a different person each time. So you don't have to worry about them getting mad at you. It's a different person each time. If you both cooperate, you get 3 points each. If you both defect, you get 1 point each. If you defect, you stab your buddy in the back, and he cooperates, you get 5, he or she gets nothing. Same if they stab you in the back, but you don't cooperate. So I want you to get just kind of an intuitive feel of the logic of the prisoner's dilemma. So everyone get a partner and stand up and find space. And again, this part obviously I'll cut out of the YouTube. Okay, all right, so write down how many points you get, add them up. Okay, who thinks they may have gotten the most points? Let's see who, in fact, did. I mean, the most you can get is 15. Did anyone get 15? You got 15? All right, good job. There you go. That's the prize you get. Okay, so what's the point of this silly little activity? Well, as I say, this has the kind of game theoretic logic of a lot of cooperative situations. In a lot of cooperative situations, from the selfish point of view, the best thing to do is do nothing and hope the other person does the work. So that's the 5, right? So you defect, you don't cooperate, but the other person does. Like say you're in a group project. What's the best case scenario? The best case scenario is your partner does the work well and you do nothing. Then you didn't have to work and you still get the A. Great, right? But then if you both think that, you wind up here in kind of the worst case scenario for the group considered overall. The best case scenario for the group considered overall is here. But from the selfish point of view, whatever the other person does, it's better for you to do nothing. So the way this plays out is, if it's a one-shot game, like we just did, no matter what the other person does, it's better for you to defect. But if it's repeat, if you're going to play with the same person over and over again, so in my moral psych class, I do a second version where you stay with the same person and go over and over again. And then it feels a little different. Because now if you just thumbs down, they're going to start doing thumbs down, and then you're both screwed. So someone named Axelrod did something really clever. They had this game, and they asked programmers and scientists to send different strategies to compete with each other. So just kind of, virtual agents that had a computer code. And they wanted to see which strategy would win, which strategy would get the most points. In, again, the repeat ones, where you play with someone over and over again, not just one shot. Like one shot, it's better to defect. If it's repeated games, the best strategy was actually the simplest. It was called tit for tat. So tit for tat is, you can write it down with a few lines of code. You cooperate on the first move, and after that, you do whatever the other person did on the last round. So, and this is how a lot of social animals, humans included, act. We're nice as kind of a first instinct. If we meet a stranger, we don't start beating them up. So you start being cooperative, but then you retaliate with what they do. If they're mean to you, you're mean back. If they start being nice again, you'll forgive, right? If they're nice enough. And that's the way this works. So if they defect, you defect back. But then if they start being nice again, you start being nice back. So that's the winning strategy if you see the same person over and over again. There's another game that so this is I would say the prisoner's dilemma. Another economic game that's a lot of work's been done on is the ultimatum game. Is this one in the key terms? I don't know if I talked about it with my Monday class. I don't have the key terms open. It is, yeah. It is? Okay, good. So the ultimatum game is one where there are two people, again, and one person is given, $100, or if it was my lab at the U of A, 100 tokens for a draw, because my lab was cheap. So 100 something. And there's the dictator who's given the money, so to speak. Well, don't worry about that term, but the person who's given the money, dictator actually I think is a slightly different one. So the person who's given the money then makes an offer to the other person, just one offer of splitting the money. And the other person can accept or reject. If they reject it, no one gets any money. And so, if you're strictly being rational, you should accept whatever the other person does as long as it's more than 0. So even if they offer 95 and 5, Well, if you say no, you get nothing, but there's some cultural variation here, but at least in cultures like Canada and the United States, most people get pissed off if you give them a low offer. And they'll terminate and say no one gets anything. There's points I can make building off of that, but I'll keep it simple. That's just the structure of the ultimatum. Okay, there are different kinds of thinking that occur when groups of people get together. Different ways that the thinking can go wrong. And two that are somewhat similar, but their definitions are distinct, are group polarization and groupthink. If you want just to get a first sense of the difference, group polarization is about extremes. So groups getting together and talking with each other and becoming more extreme in a given direction. And groupthink is about suppressing disagreement, trying to agree with each other. So I'll say a bit more about each. So for group polarization, if a group of individuals get together and they have some initial level of agreement in a given direction, so say it's a political party and they're center right or they're center left, what they will do is mutually reinforce and kind of egg each other on and go further in that direction. So over time, groups tend to become more extreme than any of the individuals within the group. In theory, it could be in a good direction. You could have a group of, people who like giving to charity, and they can become polarized in that direction. But it's about becoming more extreme on a given dimension. Whereas groupthink is when, for various reasons, and there's studies on different variables that increase the likelihood of groupthink, but this is where disagreement is not encouraged. There's pressure, maybe from an authority figure or other variables, that increase the likelihood that people will keep their disagreements to themselves. But this leads to bad decisions being made. So there are lots of historical examples that are used. Maybe the most common one is the Challenger explosion. That usually shows up in textbooks. How many of you know about the Challenger explosion? So this was a rocket that was scheduled to take off. I believe it was the first time they were going to put a non-astronaut in a rocket ship. The weather was bad. They really should have known that, but it was a big media event, so there was a lot of pressure to move ahead with it. And as the name of the event suggests, not long after takeoff, it exploded midair. So whenever there's kind of pressure to reach a decision, dissent can be suppressed and bad decisions get made. Any questions? When you're in a group, another thing that can happen is de-individuation. So if you break the term down, de means like to undo something or reduce something. And then of course this relates to the term individual. So when you're in a group, it's easy to lose your sense that you're an individual who's responsible for your actions. You start to sort of become part of the blob of the group. And you therefore do things that you may not otherwise do. So this is how a protest that starts off peaceful can turn into a riot, right? People sort of lose their sense of accountability and find themselves doing things they normally wouldn't do. And this gets worse if there's masks involved. As soon as people cover their face, you get really big de-individuation effects. One really simple study that bore this out, they had a bowl of Halloween candy outside a house with a sign that said, only take one piece or something like that. And there was a hidden camera, and they looked at how many kids took more than the sign said they should. So the higher the bar means a higher percentage of kids in that condition took more candy than they were supposed to. So there's two variables here. There's whether the kids are alone or in a group. And as you can see, the bars are higher here. They're higher in the group condition. So when kids are in a group, they're more likely to steal extra candy. And then if you look within each group, there's a distinction between identified and anonymous, which I believe in this study was defined by which kids had a Halloween mask that covered their face. And again, within each condition, the orange bar, which is the anonymous kids who have the mask, take more candy. So this is an example, and it's especially high in the anonymous kids in a group. This is an example of what we call an interaction effect, which you'll learn more about in statistics. Okay. Another term that relates to something we talked about in the emotion chapter is social facilitation. Here's the one sentence definition. When people watch you doing a task, you will do better if the task is easy, and you'll do worse if the task is hard. So, being watched makes you do better on easy or well-practiced tasks, but worse on difficult or not so well-practiced tasks. So this connects back to an idea we saw in the emotion chapter, which is that increased arousal has that effect. If you have more arousal, like if you're at the high end, it makes you do better on easy tasks, but worse on difficult tasks. And just to make that, the added ingredient, of course, is that being watched increases arousal, right? We are a social species. We care about being evaluated. So if we feel we're being evaluated, we're in a kind of heightened state. So to make this idea intuitive, imagine I gave you one lesson on juggling. Can anyone juggle here? Right. So after one lesson, you're not going to be also good at it. So imagine doing it by yourself after the one lesson, or doing it in front of this class. Probably you're going to do worse in front of the class. But here's a task that all of you may not be, quote, good at, but you at least know how to do it. It's a task that's well practiced. Think about running. So even if you're not a good runner, you know how to do it. It's one foot in front of the other. You just keep doing that. Imagine running by yourself versus running with this class watching you. Probably you'll run faster when the people watch you. The heightened state is very easy to translate into running faster. So that should make the concept intuitive. Does that make sense? However, if you're in a group, and I suppose being watched in a sense, but if it's not clear who's contributing, if you're working on something and you don't know who's doing what, you tend to get something called social loafing, which is what it sounds like. The bigger the group, the less hard people work. at least if you don't get bonus rewards for working harder. So like group projects in college where there's one grade, you tend to get this. Because people have less motivation to work. There are really simple studies on this. One is just you have people pull a rope that's attached to something that measures the amount of force. The more people you attach to the rope, the lower the average amount of pull is. So that's a simple example of social loafing. Okay, next term, which will lead us to a video. Work in this area was started by a single event, the murder of Kitty Genovese. So Kitty Genovese was a woman in New York. She was brutally attacked and screamed for help for a long period of time before she succumbed to her injuries. And I forget the amount of time, but it was over half an hour before anyone even called 911, let alone went to help her. So this was very startling. I think it was closer to an hour if I remember correctly. And so psychologists started to hypothesize about why this is. You know, are New Yorkers just cruel and mean? Well, the variable that they hypothesized mattered was how many people are in downtown New York. They conjectured that when there's more people present, it's less likely that anyone will help. And this has been borne out in subsequent controlled experiments, and the finding has the name the bystander effect. So you could study this in controlled settings. My Monday class suggested a variety of variables that might be relevant in New York, and probably there are other variables. But this refers to the fact that the more people are present, the less likely it is that anyone helps. Or the longer it takes for anyone to help. So, if you're going to have a heart attack out there, you should hope or pray to whichever God you believe in that it happens when there's one person around. That's the best case scenario. The more people are around, the less likely people are to intervene. So, I'll show a video of this in action. Okay, so there you see it in action. Now, in the controlled experiments, what they'll do is have situations like that occur in the lab. So someone appears to have a seizure, or I think in one study they had smoke pour in from under the door, seeming like there was an emergency. And you randomly assign people to different conditions. In one condition, they're the only people in the room. In the other condition, they put 3 people in the room, and so on. And the more people you put in the room, the slower people are to do anything. So that's just a finding. That's just the phenomenon. The question is why? And the video makes reference to one of the explanations. So the next 2 terms are both explanations of this effect. One is the diffusion of responsibility. So if something is diffuse, that means it's more spread out. So the diffusion of responsibility is everyone thinks someone else will do something. But if everyone thinks that, then no one does anything. So that's one explanation that probably explains some of the effect. As an aside, this is why in an emergency, if you're, let's say you know CPR and you're helping someone out, never say someone call 911. You always single someone out and say, you please call 911. You're much more likely to get it to happen. So that's the first explanation. Yeah, that's a good call. The second explanation is pluralistic ignorance. So pluralistic ignorance has a definition that will sound kind of goofy, but after I give some examples, I think it'll be more intuitive. Pluralistic ignorance is a situation where no one believes X, but everyone believes that everyone else believes X. So I'll say that again and then give some examples. So pluralistic ignorance is a situation where no one believes X, but everyone believes that everyone else believes X. So, a simple example. They've done work looking at fraternities that have dumb practices. So, groups of guys who, let's say, get drunk every Friday till they throw up. And you ask all the guys, do you think that drinking beer till you throw up is fun and cool? And the guys say, no, I don't. I think it's kind of stupid, but all my fraternity brothers think that it's cool and fun. And then every guy says that. So that would be a situation where you have pluralistic ignorance. No one believes X, no one thinks it's cool to drink beer till you throw up, but everyone thinks that everyone else believes that. As an example of an emergency where you get a kind of bystander effect, take the case where you're in the lab, you're in the condition with 10 people, and smoke pours into the room. You don't believe it's safe. You're like, that looks like smoke. Someone should be doing something. That's in your kind of internal dialogue. But you look around at everyone else. No one's getting up. So you think, well, they must think it's okay. And everyone thinks that. So no one believes it's safe, but everyone believes that everyone else believes it's safe. So that's a way in which you can get this situation of pluralistic ignorance, which can also contribute to the bystander effect. Any questions about these terms? So earlier we talked about cooperation. So cooperation is where two or more people work together and they mutually benefit. In evolutionary terms, it's pretty easy to see how that emerges. You know, two are stronger than one. There's lots of species that engage in this kind of cooperation. So you think of packs of wolves, right? They cooperate to hunt larger animals, and they get more meat than they could on their own. So pretty easy to tell an evolutionary story about why that would be advantageous. What's harder to explain is the occurrence of altruism. So altruism, or self-sacrifice, is where an organism helps out another organism and it costs them. They're not benefiting, at least not in the short term. So that's harder to explain because evolution, the logic of evolution and natural selection is competitive. It's about getting your genes into the next generation, not helping some other guy spread his genes. So how do you get this kind of behavior? And there are two common theories. If you're in my 1100, you'll have already heard about this, or if you took it earlier. One is kin selection, and that's the simpler one. So kin is an old-fashioned term for family. So the idea here is genes which predispose you to helping your relatives are adaptive. They are more likely to get passed on because your relatives share your genes. Right? Your siblings or children share half, cousins less, and so on. So genes that predispose you to helping them out are more likely to get passed on. The simplest case of kin selection is caring for children, right? So lots of altruistic behavior you see in the animal kingdom is parent for child, right? Mother doing it for a child, for example. Now, why is that? This is kind of goofy, but one way to put the evolutionary point, genes which made parents likely to think, oh, a baby, free source of protein. Those genes did not get passed on, right? Whereas genes which predispose you to care for and self-sacrifice for your child are more likely to get passed on. Now, I should add, and this is always important to say this when talking about evolution, we're not saying that people are consciously thinking this, right? No one, when they love their kid, is thinking, ah yes, I love Timmy because it will increase my chance of spreading my genes. If you think that way, there's probably something wrong with you. The idea is that genes which predispose people towards being like that were more likely to get passed on. So that's the standard explanation for altruism for kin. But what about altruism towards non-kin? This is more rare, but in some species, certainly including humans, people self-sacrifice for people that they are not related to. How do we get those tendencies to evolve? And the standard theory here is reciprocal altruism. The basic idea here is, I help you today, you help me tomorrow. So if you're in the hunter-gatherer context, hunting is a lot of luck involved. You may have a good week or a bad week. And the idea here would be, you're with your buddies that are not necessarily related to you. They have a bad week and don't get any wildebeest or whatever they hunt. You have a dead wildebeest, and you say, hey, I'll share my wildebeest with you today, which is altruistic. You're giving up some of your food and giving it to them, but it goes along with the expectation that you'll give some to me if you have a good week. And I'm going to be kind of angry at you if you don't reciprocate when you have a good week. So you only get this if the capacity for cheater detection evolves with it. Because otherwise, the cheaters win the evolutionary game. If there's an organism that is predisposed to accept altruism from others, but never be altruistic back, they're going to spread their genes more. It should be easy to see that. So you have to have both the tendency to be nice, but also the ability to recognize, hey, that guy is not giving back. So you tend to only see this in animals that are smart enough to do that, to remember who's given and who hasn't. So obviously humans do that, but another example is vampire bats. There's some really good experimental work on them. So vampire bats, as the name implies, suck blood from other animals, but they share the blood with the other vampire bats. Aw, isn't that nice? But if one vampire bat has a bad night, the other vampire bats will share with them. But if that vampire bat doesn't share when it has a good night, they start to exclude that one. They're like, okay, we're not sharing our blood with you anymore. So those are what operate at the evolutionary level. Any questions about those? Okay, but what about at the proximate level? What about what's going on in people's heads when they engage in altruistic behavior? And here there's a distinction between two theories. And these are theories that were tested by Daniel Batson. Now, I'm familiar with these papers. Pretty small sample sizes. I teach them more in my moral psych class, but they're interesting to know. One is the empathy altruism hypothesis, and the other is the negative state relief explanation. So these are two different explanations of altruistic behavior. And these are in terms of what's going on in people's heads. The empathy altruism hypothesis is the hypothesis that it's empathy that drives altruism. And by empathy, he means putting yourself in someone else's shoes and feeling their pain. So you imagine what it's like to be them, and you think, oh, that would be really sad. I want to help them. I want to alleviate their suffering. The negative state relief model is more of a cynical one. The idea here is seeing someone else in pain causes you to have a negative state, some kind of negative emotion. Like it makes you stressed out, or it makes you feel guilty, or some other negative emotion. And when you help them, you don't care about them getting better, you're just trying to get rid of your own negative emotion, whether it's being stressed out or guilty or what have you. The way that Batson would test this is he would give people another way of making themselves feel better without giving, and see if that reduced the altruistic behavior. That would be a way of supporting this one. His studies generally found support for the first hypothesis, but as I say, the sample sizes were very small. It's kind of in the old days before the replication crisis, but they're both ideas that are talked about in the literature. Leaving aside the question of support for the ideas, do the ideas make sense? So Batson is, as I say, he's a pro-empathy guy. I'll mention in passing, some of you might find this book interesting. There's a book by Paul Bloom called Against Empathy, which is a very grabby title. A lot of people don't read further than that. What Bloom argues in that book is that empathy is not a good moral guide because it's subject to various biases. For example, it's easier to feel empathy for people who are more similar to you. And that while empathy might be nice in some situations, when we're making moral decisions, we should be a bit more cold and calculated. What he calls it rational compassion. So we care for people, but we're not necessarily trying to feel their pain. I'm not necessarily saying I agree or disagree, but it's an interesting book. Now, on a funny note, I'll give some recommendations to you, because this book is on my shelf. And I once had a girl over, and her eyes went right to this and took it off the shelf, and she was like, "What's this? Why do you have this?" So it was a red flag. So if you're a guy, it's a good book, but put it in your drawer is my advice. Okay, that's the end of the kind of niceness section. The next section, which goes on for a while, is the section on interpersonal attraction. Most of this is on sexual attraction. So humans are a sexually reproducing species, obviously, and there's a lot of social psychological work on the different types of variables that influence attraction. The first section is on selectivity. So choosiness in selecting a mate. To start with the most basic fact, when you, and again, no one's consciously thinking this, but from the gene's eye view, when you have sex and produce a child, you are mixing your genes with someone else's genes. And it's in your interest that they be good genes. Or to put another way, genes which predispose you to be more choosy about who you mix your genes with are adaptive. They will tend to spread. And there's a well-studied sex difference in this regard. For short-term mating, for kind of hookups, if you like, men are much less choosy than women. And there are almost certainly both biological and cultural reasons for this. So the book mentions that the social stigma associated with sexual partners is greater for women, and that's true cross-culturally. At the biological level, I talk more about this in 1100. There's a whole section on this. But it has to do with something that Trivers called minimum parental investment. So the amount of investment that a female has to make in order for the child to survive is much longer than it is for a male. I'll try not to be funny about this, but it's at least 9 months plus a certain period of breastfeeding in the ancestral environment. Whereas the amount of time a male has to invest in order for the child to survive is, insert joke here, right? Not very long. And so over evolutionary time, this leads to selection pressure for females to be more choosy. If I'm going to be saddled with these genes, so to speak, for a year plus, they might as well be good genes. So there's a very funny study that I talk about in 1100. It's one of those studies you probably wouldn't get away with doing today, but they sent out a group of attractive men and women into a university campus and told them to approach random members of the opposite sex and ask them one of 3 questions. How many of you have heard of this study? I don't know if any of you heard of it. Oh, no, okay, you're in for a fun little, yeah. So they ask some people, will you go to dinner with me tonight? Will you go back to my apartment? Or will you go to bed with me? So they just come, introduce themselves and say, I find you attractive, would you like to X? And when women are approached by random good-looking dudes, anyone want to guess? What percentage say yes to dinner with an attractive stranger? No one wants to guess. So 50%. So that's pretty good, right? 50% is good batting average. For apartment, less than 10% say yes. And for bed, literally 0. Not a single woman says yes to that with the attractive stranger. For men, also 50% for dinner. And as I'm going to say in a second, you find that for potentially long-term type relationships, men and women are equally picky. But this is where it goes off the rails. Over 60% said yes to this, and 75% said yes to this. So that's pretty sad. So well replicated difference there, probably with both biological and cultural reasons. Now, another variable that the book talks about is proximity. This is one that you might not think about, but it explains a lot of the variation in who people wind up with. So if you thought right now, what are the things you look for in a partner? Probably how close they live to me is not going to come to your mind. But in terms of who you wind up with, that's one of the best predictors. And actually that's true both for romantic and non-romantic relationships. So just for friendships, it's true too. They've done studies of like college dorms, and the people you're most likely to become friends with are the ones with the dorm rooms close to you. So there are obvious practical reasons for that. But in terms of attraction, there's another contributing factor here, which is the mere exposure effect. You may have seen this in 1100. Anyone see this term in 1100? Yeah, so the mere exposure effect, you can define it in one sentence. The more you see something, the more you like it. This is true even with simple visual stimuli. So if I showed you 20 random images on the screen for like 10 seconds each, and then next week I show you 40 images, 20 of them are the same ones and 20 are new, and I randomize the order, even if you don't remember which ones you saw, you will find the ones you saw more aesthetically pleasing. And the same is true with people. So people that you see more, you over time perceive them as more attractive. So this is another reason that proximity influences attraction, because if you're physically close, you tend to see them more often. One person who takes advantage of this is George Costanza. How many of you know the show Seinfeld? So, George is my favorite character, but we can't all have everything. He was not blessed with good looks, and he takes advantage of this. He has a strategy that I'll show some footage of. If he, by some miracle, gets a first date, he will make sure that he forgets something in her purse or at her apartment, so then he has to call her up and say, oh, I forgot my such and such, so can we meet up for you to give it back? And then he'll do it again. He says, by the 4th time I meet up with her, I'm a little bit less repulsive. So we'll listen to him explaining his strategy. Now, I'm not necessarily recommending this, but it's a nice illustration of the mirror exposure effect. Okay, what about physical features? So there are different features that are correlated with attractiveness. Some of these are cross-culturally universal. Others are more the product of culture. So some variables that are attractive cross-culturally are things like facial symmetry. So bilateral symmetry. So how similar is one half of the face to the other? If one half is, I mean, you can think of an extreme case. If one half is totally different, that would look kind of odd, not so attractive. So cues like that, symmetrical face, clear skin, are cues to health. Because remember that you're mixing your genes with this person, and deviations from bilateral symmetry are cues to either genetic mutations or developmental problems and other things that are going to be relevant to the health of your offspring. I mean, this might seem kind of silly, but if you just imagining in your head a very healthy face, just imagine a face that's as healthy as you can imagine of the opposite sex if you're heterosexual. And then imagine a very attractive face. Kind of similar thing, kind of similar image that you conjure up. Another variable that might surprise you, averageness is more attractive. Might seem like a contradiction, but what I mean by that is if you take a bunch of faces and average them together, the resulting face is more attractive than any of the inputs. So I think Paul Bloom puts it this way in his intro lectures. If I was to try to figure out who the most attractive person in the class is, the answer would be all of you. If you took all the faces and morphed them together, the result would be more attractive. So in this case, these three women, if you morph their faces together with computer technology, the resultant face is the most attractive of the four. Again, the logic here is deviations from that are likely to be the result of some kind of developmental issue. So there's symmetry, averageness. Then there's the issue of masculinization or feminization of the face. Now I should be clear. Of course here we're talking about on average, people have different things they're into. So be free, be into whatever you're into, but on average what you find is the relationship between, so let's take males first, masculinization of the face and attractiveness, so here, more masculine, less masculine. The relationship is something like this, where it's a curvilinear relationship, where the optimal is somewhere in the middle. So if you look at these faces, if you're at the far end, very low in masculinization, okay, that's not so attractive. But if you're too high, this guy kind of looks like a murderer, so maybe that's too high. So that's what you find with masculinization versus feminization. When you look below the neck, there's contributions both of biology and culture. As far as shape, it's a pretty reliable finding cross-culturally that women prefer a man to have the shoulders wider than the waist, it's the kind of shoulder to waist ratio, and men prefer women to have hips wider than the waist. So that's cross-cultural. But as far as weight, there's quite a bit of variation. So the extent to which skinniness is viewed as attractive seems to be a product of culture. You can even just look within, say, Western culture, say over the last 200 years, what's viewed as the ideal has changed. And if you look between cultures, you also see differences. So one anecdote, you don't put too much weight in anecdotes, but I had heard that in, say, West African cultures, men prefer women to be larger. And I had a coworker from Nigeria, and it was at a warehouse, so you talk about stuff like this. So I said, is that true? Is it true that men in your culture view it as more attractive when a woman is larger? And I like having a job, so I won't imitate the accent. But he said, of course, the bigger, the better. So that's just an anecdote, but studies do bear it out that there is a cultural impact on that. Okay. Another term, I don't know how to pronounce this. In other textbooks I've seen, it just calls it similarity. This book calls it homophily, I don't know. I know the root word. So homo just means the same. The Greek word philos has to do with love or attraction. So the idea here is opposites attract is wrong. So when it comes to traits like what values you have, even things like levels of intelligence, people tend to be attracted to and wind up with people who are similar to them. So across many different measures, similarity is attractive. If you took 1100, you'll know there's a big exception, and you probably know it anyways, and that's genetic relatedness. On that dimension, similarity is not attractive, unless you live in Kentucky. Other than that, less genetic relatedness is better. Oh, I forgot to show, okay, this is just kind of a funny clip. So I mentioned that there's variation in preferences for weight, but one finding, again, just within Western countries, women tend to overestimate how skinny men want them to be, and men tend to overestimate how muscular women want them to be. This is, of course, on average, lots of variation, but I saw a funny reel on Instagram that's a good illustration. Okay, there's a bit left in the attraction section, but it's probably a good place for a break. Let's go until 11:05. Okay, so let's finish up the interpersonal attraction section. So the section ends by distinguishing different types of love or attraction. This grows out of the work of Sternberg. There's a model that I think is better. It gets at a similar distinction, but it comes from the anthropologist Helen Fisher. And her account, I think, is much more serious. She tries to integrate it with neurobiology, so I think it's a more plausible account. So Helen Fisher distinguishes between three different types of attraction, or three things that fall under the umbrella of what we might call love. And she argues that each is associated with a different brain system. So the first, the simplest one, is just sexual lust, which really needs no further explanation. The next is what you might call romantic attraction, or what might sometimes be called infatuation. So this is that when you're starting to see someone seriously, you're kind of, quote, falling in love with them, so you become kind of obsessed, can't stop thinking about them. Your heart starts to go fast when they walk in the room, all that great stuff would fall into that one. And then there's the last one, which is bonding or attachment. So this is what takes more time to build up. It's that feeling of being very safe with someone, very attached to them. So this is like peak when you're really old, those cute old couples that stare into each other's eyes or whatever. They might not be obsessed like they were when they were 21, but you can have this last one. So she argues that the first is associated with hormones like testosterone and estrogen. Although even in women, testosterone plays a role. There's a lot of evidence for that. Romantic attraction, the neurotransmitter that she argues is most important, is dopamine. This is the same one that's released when you take addictive drugs or eat really good food. So it's a very important neurotransmitter for pleasure and motivation. And then the last one is associated with the release of oxytocin. So very important for trust, bonding, and attachment. Other neurotransmitters are involved too, but those are maybe the most important. One thing the book talks about, although it uses somewhat different terms, is the second one kind of peaks early in a serious relationship and may start to go down after a while. You can't stay like this for years on end, and it's possible to misinterpret that as a sign that, oh, I must no longer be in love, but it may be just that you can't maintain that high forever. That's a wise thing to be aware of. And I guess I should say the first one, in Fisher's account, need not even be directed at one specific person, right? This can just be a generic human drive that you just feel you need to satisfy. I do have a video of her talking, but I was pretty tight for time in the Monday class. So I'll just say lots of YouTube of her. She has a lot of interesting things to say. She's also done fMRI studies of people who are in love, people who are in the last stage, and people who are heartbroken, the whole thing. So she's done some really interesting work. So lots of her stuff's available. Any questions about these three? And I guess I should add, they're not mutually exclusive. You could feel all three for one person, but they are in principle distinguishable. Okay, so the next section is on kind of group dynamics, including some bad things like prejudice and racism, sort of intergroup cognition. So there are three terms here that we sometimes use interchangeably, but they are distinct. They can reinforce each other, but you should keep the definitions separate. And those three are stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. So stereotypes are beliefs. More specifically, they are generalized beliefs about another group. So if you believe all or most people in group X have this trait, that would be a stereotype. It can be a positive trait or a negative trait. It'll still count as a stereotype. Prejudice is a negative attitude that includes disliking the group. So this one has by definition, negative valence. So prejudice comes from the word prejudge. The idea would be, you decide in advance, I don't like people from that group. Now, some negative stereotypes might lead to prejudice, but they are distinct. Prejudice is by definition emotionally valenced. And then the last one is discrimination, which is behavior. So this is engaging in behavior that excludes people from other groups. So if you refuse to hire people from X group, go out of you won't befriend people in X or whatever, anything like that, where you're doing things that exclude people from another group, that's discrimination. Now, one issue is people will not always be forthcoming about their attitudes. So take, prejudice. Especially nowadays, people would be unlikely to say on a survey, yes, I am racist, or what have you. So this leads to a bit of a conundrum about measuring these attitudes. And one attempt at measuring what are called implicit attitudes, so attitudes that people won't necessarily explicitly endorse, is the implicit association test. How many of you have heard of this? So it was developed a while ago now. Very simple idea. And it's easy to, if you Google IAT, you could do it at home. I thought about having it as a group activity, but I don't want people being nervous, like, oh no, people will think I'm racist. But what you're given is a set of images and words. And there's different versions, but this version is for race. So some of the faces look European, and some look like they're of African descent. And you have the left key and the right key. I think it's like E and I or something. And you're told initially to press one key if it's a black face or a bad word, and press the other key if it's a white face or a good word. You're supposed to do as quickly as you can without making any mistakes. And then it switches. Then it's blackface, good word, and it'll on the screen, blackface, good word, or whiteface, bad word. And the order, of course, is randomized. So some people will do it with the blackface, good word first. Doesn't really make much difference for whatever that's worth. And then you measure the difference in reaction time. And what you find is, say for white Americans, they're somewhat slower at pressing the keys when it's blackface, good word. It's a little harder to push that I key. And you just measure the difference in reaction time, and you get a measure of implicit bias. Now, there's an ongoing debate about the validity of the measure, so what you want to find then is that implicit attitude can do things like predict behavior. So there's a number of studies on this, looking at, for example, do people with more implicit bias in this sense sit farther away from minorities? Or are they, in another game, are they more likely to see a gun where there isn't one when it's a minority face? There's a number of different attempts at establishing the predictive validity of these measures. I won't get into that issue, that's more advanced, but does the basic setup of the test make sense? So yeah, you can go home and try it yourself. You see how well you do, or how well is kind of a weird way to say it, but very easy to find online. Okay, anything anyone wants me to repeat before I move on? The next term, the book calls it behavioral confirmation. I'm going to use the other term, which I think is more self-explanatory, and that's self-fulfilling prophecy. In my experience, you'll see this more often in the literature. The book calls it behavioral confirmation. These are synonyms. So prophecy here is being used a little bit tongue-in-cheek. So a prophecy is, a prediction about the future, but it need not be a religious one. In this context, it just means any expectation about what's going to happen, any belief you have about, as I say, what's going to happen. The way to think about this term is it's a kind of three-part definition. The first part is you have a belief or an expectation. Step two, the belief influences your behavior. And step three, your behavior causes your belief to be true. So you have a belief or an expectation. That belief or expectation influences your behavior in some way, and lucky for you, your behavior causes the belief to be true. So hence, self-fulfilling. So I'll go through some examples. So probably the most famous study on this, they went into a classroom in the United States. I think it was the United States. They gave the kids an IQ test. And they randomly assigned the kids to two conditions. One condition, they told the teachers, these kids, real smart. They're really bright kids. These other kids, not so promising. In fact, the kids in the two groups were, on average, the same. They just wanted to see if the teacher's expectations would affect the student's performance. So they come back in a year, and voila, the kids in the smart group do better on standardized tests. So what's going on here? Well, it's a classic case of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the teachers now have a belief about this half of the class. They think, oh, this half of the class is smart. These kids are promising. So what do? Well, that belief changes how they treat those kids. Maybe they call on them more, give them more encouragement, or various other things. As a result, it actually makes it come to pass. Those kids actually do better, as measured by tests at the end of the next year. So that's one example. Another study, quite a cleverly done one. They had a bunch of men got a bunch of men into the lab and set them up on telephone calls with random women, and they were all given a piece of paper with a description of the woman and a picture. Now the picture was not of the woman they were talking to. They didn't know that, but it was just a stock picture. Half the men are given an attractive face, the other half are given a less attractive face. There's a well-established bias wherein people tend to assume that better-looking people are nicer. Lots of studies find this. And so at the beginning of the study, they asked the men, how nice does this woman seem? And they say that the men who are in the attractive condition, they expect the woman to be nicer. So they're on the phone, and if you think someone's not going to be nice, you're kind of defensive and curt and so on, which the men were. They were less nice over the phone. So the belief affects their behavior. Now, how do you respond when someone's not nice to you? You're not nice back. So the women in the less attractive condition, as a result of the way the men treated them, were in fact less nice. And the men say, see? Just as I predicted. But it's only because their behavior made it so. So that's another case of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Any questions on that? Another term I'll just briefly mention, subtyping. So this is essentially a way of engaging in confirmation bias vis-a-vis stereotypes. So if you have a stereotype about another group, so let's say your stereotype is Bulgarians are aggressive. That's your stereotype. But then you meet some Bulgarians who are nice. What you'll do is, they're the exception. They're the good ones. Which may seem nice, but in fact it's a way of keeping your stereotype immune from falsification. Because every time you get a disconfirmation, you just say, no, that's the exception. They're one of the, quote, one of the good ones. Okay, so that's all, of course, depressing. Is there anything shown to reduce prejudice or these other bad things? So lots of different lines of research, but one famous study is the Robbers Cave study. So Robbers Cave was a summer camp that a psychologist took a bunch of young boys to. I mean, the parents consented. He wasn't kidnapping anyone, but and he put them into teams. I forget what they were called, like the Eagles and the Rattlers or something like that. And what he tried to do was create intergroup hostility and then see what was most effective at reducing it. So he had them compete in various ways, and turns out, human nature, not very hard to get the groups to hate each other. Fist fights broke out, the whole 9 yards. They even developed like stereotypes of the other group. So then he tried to see what would reduce it. And merely increasing intergroup contact was not enough. Just getting them to spend more time with each other didn't reduce hostilities. What did reduce hostilities was giving them a superordinate goal. A superordinate goal is a goal that they have to work together to achieve. So this dramatically reduced intergroup hostilities. When they had a common project that they had to work on together, it reduced the animosity. So what he did was kind of set himself up as the common enemy, and I think he broke their plumbing and various other things, and it was a complex enough problem that they had to work together to solve it, and this reduced the hostility. So there's examples in history you can point to of this, where common enemies or common goals reduce hostility. Very timely, right now in Canada, we have a common threat, right? Not to get political, but the President of the United States is saber-rattling about making us the 51st state and adding tariffs and so on. And support for the Bloc Québécois falling like a stone. So, not exactly the same as like racism or hostility, but support for separatism is going down, because there's a sense that we're all Canadians, we're all in this together because there's this common threat. So kind of a recent real world case. Oh, and then I have a funny example. You'll see a lot on Instagram or TikTok. See, I'm a mature adult. I don't use TikTok. I wait for the TikToks to show up on Instagram 2 weeks later. So that's the way I do it. So this has been modified into a number of different things, but nice example of superordinate goals or common enemies reducing hostility. I apologize for the bad words, but it's a good example. Okay. So that's the end of the group dynamics section. The next section is on attribution theory. So a lot of interesting work here. So to start with, we'll see the term attribution in the Disorders chapter 2. It has a similar meaning in that context. In social psychology, an attribution is an explanation of why someone does something. So it's an explanation of why someone does something. And when I say explanation, I don't mean like a scientific explanation. I mean an explanation that ordinary people give. So the example I used on Monday was, I'm walking to the SkyTrain and I look over and I see someone kick their dog. And I go, why did that guy do that? And I come up with some inference or theory as to why he did that. So I'm making an attribution in that sense. And there are, broadly speaking, 2 different types of attributions. And I've listed in the book some synonyms for each, because you'll see them used. The easiest way to do it is to speak of personal attributions and situational attributions. So you'll sometimes see external, same as this. For this one, you may see internal or dispositional, same thing. Personal attributions explain the person's behavior in terms of their traits, in terms of who they are. So if I see the guy kicking his dog and I say, that guy's probably a real asshole, he's probably a real jerk. That's why he's just a real dog kicking kind of guy. Then I'm making a personal attribution. If I say, the dog probably bit him and I didn't see it or something like that, I'm making a situational attribution. You have some buddies or some friends, and you know that someone did poorly on a test. If you say, they must not be that bright, that would be a personal attribution. If you say, the class must be hard, or they must have had a bad night's sleep, or something like that, then you're making a situational attribution. So how do we decide which kind of attribution to make? And in one model, there are three main pieces of information we use. These should all be in the key terms. And they are consistency, distinctiveness, and consensus. So let's take a specific behavior, kind of a silly example. Suppose you have a friend named Susan. You go to the bar with Susan, and Susan punches someone in the face. There's the behavior. Susan punched someone in the face at the bar. So consistency would be, how often does Susan do X? Is she just punching people in the face all the time? And all else being equal, if consistency is high, that counts in favor of a personal attribution. Distinctiveness is, to what extent does Susan only do X in situation Y? So in this case, does Susan punch people in the face only at bars? Or does she do it in other contexts too? So if it's high in distinctiveness, if she only punches people in the face at bars, that's going to lend some weight to a situational attribution. And then the last one, consensus. Consensus is, to what extent does everyone else do X in situation Y? So if everyone in the bar is punching people in the face, if it's like a big bar fight, then obviously that counts in favor of a situational attribution, at least all else being equal. Any questions about those three? There should be like a law that you can't name two things in the same model with the same letter, but not my fault. So okay, a couple other terms here. One bias that was well replicated until recently, for reasons I'll explain, was the fundamental attribution error. You could call it the fundamental attribution bias if you like. This is a generic tendency towards making personal attributions. So the idea is, if we don't have a lot of information and we just have to not flip a coin, but you have to go with one or the other, we have a bias towards personal attributions. So all else being equal, if I have a buddy who does well on the test, I'll go, oh, that guy's a genius. I have a buddy who does well, that guy's not a genius. I go right to the personal attribution. So as I say, this was well replicated until recently. We talked about the weird problem back in chapter 2. This was one of the early things to get hit with failures to replicate cross-culturally. So, psychologists distinguish between individualistic cultures and collectivistic cultures. We saw this last week. People in individualistic cultures are much more likely to show evidence of this bias. In collectivistic cultures, you tend not to find it. Or if you find it at all, you'll find less of it. So there's less of a bias towards personal attributions. Another bias that you see less of in collectivistic cultures is the self-serving bias. So, crucially, the fundamental attribution error is for other people, especially strangers. For friends, it gets a little weird, but if there's a random guy, you don't know anything else, and you're in a Western country, you're more likely to make a personal attribution. For yourself, you have kind of a double standard. This may have come up, I think, in another chapter, but just to remind you, for yourself, if something good happens, or you do something good, then you make a personal attribution. But if you do something bad, situational attribution. So you do well in one class, well, that's because I'm smart. You do bad in the other class, the teacher doesn't like me, the class is too hard, or whatever. Convenient. I don't know if this is in the key terms, but you could also speak loosely of a friend-serving bias, which is maybe a more mild version of this. For people you like or people you're close to, you also have a tendency to make personal attributions for their good behavior and situational attributions for their bad behavior. And then one last bias, aptly named the just world bias. This is a bias towards thinking that people get what they deserve. This includes people who do well and people who don't do well. So, something terrible happens to someone, there's an impulse to think, they must have done something to deserve it. And the theory goes that one of the functions of this bias is to help us feel secure, help us feel less anxious. Because, if you think what's in fact true, that people sometimes just get unlucky, sometimes bad things happen to people for no good reason, well then bad things could happen to me. I don't like that. I'm of course a good person, so I feel safer if I think, no, that person in some way deserved it, and then, I can be confident that bad things won't happen to good people like me. Okay, so a few different things going on here. Any questions about the terms related to attributions? One term I'll just quickly define, I won't spend too much time on it. You may have heard the term reverse psychology. That's close to what this means. So reactance is an unpleasant feeling that arises from the sense that someone's trying to coerce you or influence you. if you feel like someone's trying to get you to do something, you feel unpleasant and may react against it. That's all the term reactance means. The next set of terms are really useful to know if you ever go into sales or areas like that. These are all good strategies for inducing compliance, so getting people to do things that you want them to do. So there is the risk of reactance. These other things are more indirect ways of getting people to do something that you want. So the first one is norms of reciprocity. We already talked about reciprocal altruism. That's an evolutionary theory. Norm here means like a cultural norm. In addition to having biological pre-programming towards reciprocity, every culture ever studied has something like this, a norm of, look, if someone does something nice for you, you should do something nice back. And if you don't, you should feel kind of bad about yourself. People trying to sell you things will take advantage of this. So for example, giving free samples is one easy way to induce guilt, right? Because then if you don't buy something, you feel kind of bad. Like you took something for free and didn't reciprocate. That's why stores do it. Two that sound kind of similar, they're both based on kind of the metaphor of the door-to-door salesperson. Foot in the door. And door in the face. The simple way to think about these is foot in the door, you go from small to medium request, or from a small request to a medium request. Door in the face, you go large to medium. So for foot in the door, like imagine a door-to-door salesperson. You come to the door and you sell 25-cent pins or something. Sure, you already got your wallet out, you pay for that, and then they've got, quote, their foot in the door. And it's then easier to sell the next thing. So some empirical work on this, there was a study where they went door-to-door selling pins for a candidate, so for a political candidate, and they then went around a second time door-to-door selling lawn signs. The houses where they went door-to-door and got people to buy the pins first were more likely to then agree to have the lawn sign than the other houses where they didn't go door-to-door first. So that's the way the first one works. With the second one, you start with something so large that you're almost guaranteed a no, but then the thing you actually want to sell looks reasonable by comparison. So another study, they would go door-to-door asking, and it doesn't have to be literally door-to-door for it to work, but it's just a kind of a visual metaphor. You go door-to-door asking, would you like to drive some underprivileged kids to the zoo and babysit them for the day? No one says yes. But then you say, well, would you like to donate $20 to our foundation? Well, it's pretty reasonable now, so you get more compliance that way. Okay, next we'll talk about one of the most famous, or you could say infamous, studies in psychology, and that's the Milgram study. So this is the classic study on obedience. So obedience to an authority figure. So Milgram was a Jewish American. Not too long after the Holocaust occurred. So, and you'll see him in the video, he was interested in how it was possible for otherwise normal people to engage in these unspeakably evil acts. And if you want to send a chill up your spine, there are pictures, and maybe even some footage of Auschwitz, I think it was Auschwitz guards, who had like a vacation place nearby, playing with their kids, listening to music, etc., and then by day, of course, doing evil acts. So how is that possible? How is it possible to get people to do these things? And if you ask them, so for example, Adolf Eichmann, when he was on trial, one of the things he famously said was, I was just following orders. And a lot of the people charged with war crimes said things like that. So in the aftermath of World War II, many people said, well, it must be something about the German psyche. But Milgram decided to see if he could get the same kinds of effects with an American sample. So he got a bunch of random American Joes into the lab and had them take on the role of teacher. He made it look like it was randomly assigned, but in fact it was fixed so they would all be the teachers. The learners were all actors, and the teacher, the real subject, would have a switchboard like this with buttons corresponding to different levels of shock. And whenever the learner got something wrong, they were to shock them and go up each time they got it wrong. And the learner gave convincing screams of pain, which we'll see some footage of. I may have shown it back in chapter 2, but this is a longer one with, you'll see more of what happened. And crucially, in one of the conditions, there's a man in a white lab coat telling them what to do, and we'll see a bit more footage of what happens. So as they say in passing, I forget if she gave the number, but 65% of people go all the way, even after the person is seemingly unconscious. So, you know, if they don't give an answer, that counts as wrong, and they keep giving the volts to the end. So Milgram did this actually very carefully, even though there's questions, very big questions about the ethics of the experiment. He varied the conditions systematically, and there were two things that explained a huge amount of the variance. One was the legitimacy of the authority. So if they're in the white lab coat condition, you get a lot of obedience. If the guy giving the orders is just some other participant who's been given the role of reading the instructions, obedience plummets. Another is distance from the victim. So in this condition, they're in another room. The closer they are, the less obedience you get. For personal characteristics, so they looked at things like gender, education, religion. I mean, so if they looked at sex differences, I'm curious, show of hands, who thinks the men were more likely to obey? Who thinks the women? So it turns out, no difference. So all the personal characteristics played little to no role. So religiosity, political orientation, education, didn't matter. Okay, any questions about the Milgram study? So I've now noticed that I went a little out of order. A study I was supposed to do before this, another very famous study done by Solomon Asch on conformity. So not obeying an authority figure, but going along with what your peers do. So here, the way the Asch study works is you're shown a variety of images like this. So there's the target line. That's the one you compare the other ones to. You have three options, A, B, C, and you're supposed to say which one is the same length as the target line. So in this case, if you've got 20/20 vision and no psychosis, the correct answer is C. And so if you give that just to people by themselves, they get it like 99% of the time when you show them images like this. Then you put them in a condition with confederates. And I should say that confederate should be on the key terms list. And it's not like confederates like in the Civil War. This means someone who's pretending to be a subject, but who's actually working with the experiment. So the learner in the Milgram study is a confederate, for example. in the conformity study, there are different conditions with different numbers of confederates, but the job of the confederates is to say a wrong answer. So for example, they all say B. And then the real subject is their turn, and the question is, do they conform? Do they go along with the wrong answer? And what Ash found is that if there's at least 4 or 5 people, 75% of people conform at least once to a wrong answer. So I'll show some footage of this, and even as you watch it, like even me, I can feel the pull to go along with it. So, last video of the day. Okay, so now a bit more detail here. So, as I say, Ash also varied different variables here. So, as far as group size, what you get is a linear increase in conformity with more people, up to around 4 or 5. So if you go from 1 confederate to 2 to 3, you'll get more and more conformity. After 4 or 5, adding more people stops mattering. Additionally, not super surprising, you get much less conformity if you add even 1 dissenter. So if you have 1 guy before the real subject who doesn't go along, conformity also drops by quite a bit. So there's a few terms left. Unfortunately, the last one takes the longest. It's maybe the hardest one in social psych. I'll run through a few that are quicker. The book talks about normative influence and informational influence. These both relate to conformity. Very simply, normative influence is getting people to do things. So like norms for behavior. Informational influence is getting people to believe things. So social or peer pressure to believe things would fall under the umbrella of informational influence. Next, persuasion. So this is when you're arguing with someone, trying to get them to believe something. And psychologists distinguish between 2 routes to persuasion, or 2 strategies for persuasion. There's the central route and the peripheral route. So the central route involves using facts, logic, etc. So if you want to, say, convince someone that a given policy will work, you'll show studies and make arguments. Anything else that convinces someone or leads to them agreeing with you is the peripheral route. So there are a variety of biases at work here. So if you make an emotional appeal, you try to be funny or try to appeal to other emotions to get them to believe something. Or if you're convinced on account of some other bias, so for example, there's studies showing that people in the dominant or majority group in a culture are more likely to be believed. Obviously that's irrational, but so if you're listening to a white man say something, you're on average more likely to believe what they say. If that's the reason you agree with their persuasive message, that would fall under the umbrella of the peripheral route. So anything other than facts, logic, etc. I almost said logic. That would have facts and logic together, bro. Okay, so that's persuasion. Any questions on that? Okay, the last term is, this is probably the most influential theory in social psychology, and that's cognitive dissonance. Again, it's useful to think of this as a 3-step definition. First, there is a contradiction involving your beliefs and your behavior. Now, it can be between two beliefs or two behaviors, but the standard cases that we'll talk about involve a contradiction between a belief and a behavior. But in any case, there's some kind of contradiction. Two, you notice that contradiction, and it leads to an unpleasant feeling. You feel like, ugh, I don't like being inconsistent or contradicting myself. And three, you become motivated to resolve the contradiction, or to render your beliefs and behavior consistent. So here's a silly case that I'm stealing from another professor. Let's say you know someone named Bob, and you don't like Bob. You think Bob is an idiot. You're walking by, Bob says hi. Hey, David, how's it going? And I say, hey, Bob, nice to see you. Terrible, right? So you feel like, I'm being inconsistent. And the dissonance means the unpleasant feeling. That's what the dissonance part is. So now I think, I don't like this. I have to make this consistent. So I could turn around and say, just kidding, Bob, you suck. I don't know. That'd be one way of doing it. Or I might, upon reflection, think, Bob's not so bad. Maybe I was wrong about Bob. One of the early studies on this was done by Leon Festinger. And there are alternate ways of explaining this finding, but you should at least understand how he explained the finding using cognitive dissonance. What he did was he put people in two groups, and both groups do a boring task. I forget what it was, but maybe they have a ball of colored beads, and you have to put the red ones here, the blue ones here, something simple and trivial like that. So after spending a lot of time doing that, people in both groups are paid money to go and tell another person that it's fun. They were paid $1 and $20, but this was done in the 50s, so controlling for inflation, more like $10 and $200. So this group is paid, in today's dollars, pretty serious money. And again, you're paid to go up to someone and say, that task is a lot of fun. After that, they are both asked, okay, money aside, how fun was that task really? And just think, which group is going to say it's more fun? You might be inclined to think this group, but in fact it's this group. The $10 group thinks the task was fun, and I forget how big the effect size was, but to put it crudely, not so fun. So what's going on here? The cognitive dissonance explanation is, most people believe that they are honest. We know that from survey data. In fact, most people think they are above average in most trades, which, of course, not possible by definition, but most people think they are mostly honest. And in both cases, they told a little white lie. They said, this task is really fun. Ugh. So you feel some dissonance. You're contradicting what you believe yourself to be. If you're in this group, you think about it, you go, well, yeah, I told a little white lie, but I did it for $200. Most people, even if they're mostly honest, will lie for $200. This group, wow, I told a lie for $10. You know what? I wasn't lying. That task was kind of fun. I got some value out of that. That's the way that they would explain it. This is also how psychologists explain the efficacy of hazing rituals. So I think we've talked about hazing rituals at some point. So tasks where, or not tasks, you have to do something crazy to join a fraternity, let them throw baseballs at you or drink beer till you vomit or whatever the hazing thing is. So in order to get into the group, you have to do this. And it's been shown with studies this does make people like groups more. They like groups more after going through a hazing ritual. And the cognitive dissonance explanation would be, if after you're reflecting on how good the group is, if you think this group might not be so fun, that leads to dissonance. Because no one wants to believe they're an idiot who does, lets people throw rocks at their head for nothing. So you tell, no, actually this group is pretty good. This is a good group. I didn't waste that effort. And then there's not this inconsistency between your belief that you're, a wise person and your behavior letting them throw rocks at your head to join this group. That's the last term. Any questions about cognitive dissonance? All right, see you all next week.